So hello everyone and welcome to our interview with the Right Honourable David Lammy, where we'll be talking to him about institutional racism and the criminal justice system in order to mark National Stephen Lawrence Day. And my name is Josiah.
My name is Samuel Bailey, and we are a part of the Oxford University's Oxford Black Law Alumni Network. We're some of the founding members of it, and we've come together to actually put this this interview, and it's a part of a series of events to also mark National Stephen Lawrence Day. And we hope that this kind of creates the conversation that we want to have so that we can go about addressing institutional racism that exists in the UK, that we can go about addressing the disparities, the disproportionate treatment that we've been experiencing, and really get together in the UK and understand the issues of race that really exist. So we hope that you enjoy this interview that we're having with David Lammy. So David, the most recent UK census shows that over 85% of the British population actually falls within the white British ethnic group. And so that has led many people to believe that only persons falling within this group are actually truly English, if you can quote that, and so therefore people who fall within Black minority groups are grouped based on their minorities rather than actually being said to be British or truly English people. And I've encountered a similar issue being a Jamaican who's now living in the UK. And, as you had framed it, persons who choose to return to the mother country, but they're never going to be included in a similar way. And you encountered that classification issue similarly on your recent media interview, where they brought up that whole thing about being truly English as a Black person. How do you think that probably reflects the prejudicial views that maybe exist in society against Black people and how they view us as a part of the society? And how do we go about addressing that?
Look, the first thing to understand is to draw on an understanding. If we went back 150 years, it would be at its height. Obviously, during the latter part, particularly of the slave trade, is scientific racism, and to understand that the tag that attaches to the three of us as Black is not of our making. I would prefer to say I am a human being of African descent, which understands that my ancestors spent probably many thousands of years in the continent of Africa before they were abruptly taken across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. And I'm happy to be of African Caribbean descent. But that term Black is really something that I'm afraid white Europeans invented, and they obviously attached a lot of other terms to it, many beginning with the N word. And it's that racial descriptor, that business of difference, and that interruption that human beings could be of difference is very much came out of that period as Europe colonized the world, and came up with lots of reasons to explain why white Europeans were superior to Black and brown people that they encountered across the world. And so it's very unattractive that here we are in 2021, and we have a census that allows someone like me to describe myself as British, should I choose to, Black British. British always having been a very expansive term, partly because of empire, but does not allow me, or indeed my children, to describe themselves as being English. And I think it's very dangerous if we say that Englishness can only be found if you are white. And effectively, if you are, let's say, Anglo-Saxon or Celt or something like that, I think we need a civic nationalism, if you like, civic Britishness that allows ethnic identity to be inclusive. So if you're in the United States, you can be Italian American, Jewish American, African American, Polish, all sorts of American you can be, but you're American. And that should be similar here. So I do find it deeply problematic. There are lots of Black people who don't feel comfortable saying they're English. Even though they've been here for years, their parents were here, their grandparents were here, they feel much more comfortable saying they're Black British. But let's look at the converse of this. what happens is you allow Englishness to be an ethno description attached to being white, and surprise, surprise, it's owned by those on the extreme right, groups that would be associated with the National Front, with the EDL, Tommy Robinson extremism, basically, and a very powerful sense that it's not inclusive for black or brown people. So it's come up recently because of a census. I hope it's fixed by the next census in 10 years' time, and we're not still having this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, thanks for that, David. Those were really powerful points that you've raised. And I suppose the points that you've raised lead us on to another question. So very recently, you would have seen the report by the newly formed Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, where they've said that the Macpherson definition of institutional racism has stood the test of time, but there's no evidence of institutional racism actually existing in Britain today. For example, with respect to crime and policing, they say that the issue of black overrepresentation in the criminal justice system may not be attributable to institutional racism. And they use evidence from your review, the Lammy review of 2017, to try and develop this argument. And they quote a passage from your review, which says that, I quote, "Many of the causes of BAME overrepresentation lie outside of the criminal justice system, as do the answers to it. People from a black background are more likely to live in poverty than those from a white background. Black children are more likely to grow up in a lone parent family. Black and mixed ethnic boys are more likely than white boys to be permanently excluded from school and to be arrested as a teenager." Now, those are some pretty powerful comments. Now, do you agree with the Commission that there is no evidence of institutional racism today? And do you agree that institutional racism might not be the cause of black overrepresentation in the criminal justice system?
Look, I'm very sad, Josiah, that you even have to ask me this question. Obviously, you're asking it on the basis of this Commission report. But basically what it's done is it's turned the very serious issue of systemic racism and the barriers, I'm afraid, that still exist for so many people of colour in developed economies like our own. It's turned it into a debating point. And it's not a debating point. It's an incredibly serious issue. And I sort of refuse really to get into a discussion that turns systemic racism into a debating point. I'm afraid it is axiomatic for me that issues that came out of Europe of systemic racism, that gave us the slave trade, that gave us colonialism, that I'm afraid there are hangovers of that still in society today for people of colour, and particularly people in our context who are of African Caribbean descent. I did a lot of work in my review. I was asked to do the review by David Cameron. I reported to Theresa May. And of course, I've got vast political differences with David Cameron and Theresa May, but it was a time when race was not being disputed. Theresa May set up the race disparity audit, and David Cameron had asked me to look at this work on the criminal justice system and disparities. I produced a cross-party report. I had an advisory group that included Conservatives, and my review was welcomed on all sides of the political divide. I travelled the world. It was very, very interesting to be in countries like Australia, Canada, where historic inbuilt discrimination against Indigenous communities was rife, and they're horribly overrepresented in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, in the criminal justice system, horrendously. And, you know, it wasn't a matter of debate that issues of systemic racism towards those communities in those countries, it wasn't a matter of debate, it was a statement of fact. And it's incredibly depressive and regressive that Britain's gone down this track. That it's the Trump playbook. And Trump may have gone in the United States, but he's birthed, I'm afraid, some terrible offshoots in our own country. I thought we were making progress, and this report sets the clock back significantly. I think it's got to be resisted. I'm only hopeful because I do think that younger generations, the millennials, Generation Y, do get this stuff. They understand it's nonsense. They want it fixed. And they recognize that Black lives do matter and need to matter, and we're in a position of action. But you'll understand, when you've been in public life for 21 years like I have, this is incredibly depressing and tiring. And it's tiring for a community to be, as my colleague Dawn Butler described in Parliament yesterday, gaslit, effectively told that you're mentally unwell, that you're making it up, that it's a lie. I don't accept that. I do think we've got to call it what it is. We've got to understand where this comes from. It doesn't mean that systemic racism is the only issue to talk about. It really isn't. There are lots of issues. It doesn't mean that, particularly as a progressive centre-left politician, that I'm not as preoccupied with issues of class, which cross racial boundaries, with issues of economy and political economy, particularly affect people's lives, with what we're doing with the public sector. All of those issues are as important to me as a politician, but we've got to be able to have an honest discussion about issues of systemic racism and understand that, yes, people can be affected purely because of the color of their skin, that when someone crosses the road, it is out of fear of us because it's deep-seated and goes back over many years. And indeed, that these things can be systemic and institutional. It's not just the act of one individual who's mean or nasty or racist. I'm afraid it happens in the workplace. It happens in public institutions. It happens far too frequently in our society, and we still have to deal with it.
No, those are powerful words.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
And I mean, and that leads to the other question that I have, which is dealing with it in the health sector specifically. So Doreen Lawrence, the mother of the late Stephen Lawrence, she had compiled a report that showed that in the COVID-19 pandemic, there was that disproportionate treatment for minority groups. And there was a Marmot review as well that had shown that over the past decade that, you know, life expectancy had stalled and the treatment of minority ethnic groups had really deteriorated. And it also showed the classism that had existed. So these reports and these reviews really show the intersection, as you were suggesting before, of the other issues of classism as well, of those from a poor and disenfranchised background, and also that overlapping with the minority communities. And so in light of this and the structural inequalities that we know exist in the health sector, how do we really go about addressing those issues that still continue to exist today?
Well, those issues, of course, hugely underlie the huge disproportionality we're seeing in death rates during this pandemic, which underlie these long-standing, deep issues of inequality. And, you know, the fact that we've got a situation where Black female mortality in birth is at such a disproportionate rate to white female mortality in birth is staggering and underlies these issues. They are issues to do with housing, issues to do with employment, issues, yes, to do with poverty, but these are systemic issues, and they do affect certain minority communities in a deeper way than we see in other parts of society. And I'm afraid we're only really just beginning to unpick some of these serious health inequalities, again, that will have gone backwards over this time. This is very real to me. My mother, who died of ovarian cancer a decade ago, presented late to the hospital with her ovarian cancer. And it was stage 3 by the time that she presented. This is very common in Black women who are used to putting up with so much and present late when these things come up, and also are often used with their experience of healthcare to feeling like they're being a nuisance, feeling like the system isn't responsive to them. So they're not that keen to go to hospital when there's a complaint. Surprise, surprise, look at the figures and the death rates. And this is my own experience of healthcare. And I'm afraid, have we made the progress we could have made here in the UK? No, we haven't. And it's really interesting when you see these outlier countries like the United States, the UK, when you then compare death rates in, say, the Caribbean or in Africa, and find, surprise, surprise, that it's better. And these are developing countries.
Yeah.
It's a curious phenomenon, but it's very real, and it underlies some of the issues that exist.
No, absolutely. Those it's really something for us to take to heart and to put to our minds. And I sort of circling back, want to take you back to an earlier point that you said in regards to institutional racism and resisting it, and how there are underlying issues which are not just about institutional racism. There are other things which are affecting us. So in June of last year, research found that Black employees hold about 1.5% of top management roles in the UK private sector, and there's been even less progress on Black representation in the public sector, where the number of Black employees in leadership roles has remained static at 1% over the last 7 years. Now, the recent report by the UK government's Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities highlights that while ethnic minorities have been making progress on the professional ladder, there remains underrepresentation at the very top. So bearing this in mind, with on this view, what impact does the underrepresentation of Black people in senior roles have in the UK economy? And how might we go about increasing Black representation in both the private and the public sector?
Well, I think it's very sad that the Commission did not support Baroness Ruby McGregor, a Conservative peer, her own report into disparities in pay, and she called for an ethnic minority pay gap reporting, which they did not implement. Make a huge difference, I think. Starting to make the case in the same way that we saw for equal pay for women. We're not there yet, but it would have been really, really important to get that. You've got to have targets. You've got to have KPIs, particularly in the private sector. You've got to really ensure that this is policed and it's looked at. And, you know, some of the race architecture that we've had in this country really applies to the public sector more than it does to the private sector. So there are big changes that are needed. At the moment, we've got a lot of warm words. Please put some Black people on your boards. You know, and you know, I'm afraid good faith is probably not going to be sufficient to bring about the sorts of changes that we need to see. You know, I think to Parliament, and I think to the progress that's been made on ethnic minorities in Parliament, on women in Parliament, and that's come about as a result of political parties ensuring that they have, you know, when they're selecting candidates, women, sometimes all women shortlists, and ethnic minorities, and using the levers of the political party to bring that about. If you just left it to good faith, I mean, I'm afraid we'd still be back in the 1950s, wouldn't we? Yeah. So I think that, you know, all of the evidence is that if you're really interested in the business of equity, then you have to understand the starting points, and you've got to understand that on the whole, if you leave it to chance and good faith, then white middle-class men will always occupy the top jobs. They'll occupy the top jobs in our FTSE 100. They'll occupy the top jobs in our judiciary, in our legal system. They'll occupy top jobs in our schools. They will always muscle out women, muscle out minorities, muscle out working class people. And therefore, the whole idea of the Labour Party, Labour, was to intervene and to start to assert rights originally for working class people. And I think there's still a job to be done in relation to these issues and minorities as well.
Thank you, David. No, that's quite important. And I mean, there's one question that I think even in light of now the Black Lives Matter movement and how much it's grown over the past year, but speaking back to those empty words and what has actually improved over the past year since we've still been doing these protests and that we've been pushing the governments to make change. The George Floyd trial with Derek Chauvin had finished, I think it was yesterday, where they found him guilty of all three counts of murder. And it's led to a discussion now of whether justice has truly been served, or other persons who have said the system is finally doing what it should have been doing for years before. And the fact that we had to wait with, bated breath to hope that he could still be found guilty because we've been used to seeing persons get off on these charges before. What do you think about this discussion and whether the actual justice system has been improving over the past year, or whether this BLM movement that we've been pushing has not actually affected any change at all?
Look, I want to be hopeful. I think that Black Lives Matter has captured a mood amongst a generation, and in that sense, it's a bit like the 60s. And that mood becomes expansive and it doesn't just dissipate. But I think we've got to be honest. We all saw George Floyd murdered. We saw it with our eyes. And it's extraordinary that there was even a debate about whether this verdict would come back in the way that it would, because we know that the history in America is such that white supremacy is such that even what is true and you can see in your eyes is deemed something else. It's tragic that since George Floyd's murder, there have been many, many others. The images of that 13-year-old boy shot down last week were just absolutely horrendous. I've got a 13-year-old son. He looked like my son. So we know that this verdict, I'm afraid, doesn't fix the system. And Joe Biden's been talking about that today. The issues are systemic. They're real. And they're going to take real reform. And it's going to take a Herculean effort. And I'm afraid between now and the utopia that we're trying to aim for, there will be many, many other Black lives lost. So we cannot give up the fight. And I think it's right to say that here in Europe, there's a tradition, isn't there? Particularly because there's a problem in the United States with guns, of course, to look across the pond, pat ourselves on the back and say their racism is so much worse than ours. We must be doing really well. And I think we've got to resist that. Yes, we haven't got the guns, so we don't have quite the violence, but we still have some very, very systemic issues that we have to unpick here, whether you're in the UK, whether you're in France, whether you're in Italy. Very, very real issues for people of colour and Black people, particularly in our criminal justice systems. We saw after George Floyd so many incidents of what looked like poor policing in relation to Black and brown people in this country. When you've got an athlete pulled out of a car and handcuffed with a baby crying in the back, not really regarded with the human dignity that you would normally afford a young mother, certainly a white young mother, there's something, tells you that there's something up with the system. So there's so much that we have to do in our own country. And my review was a starter for 10 on some of the things that if we implemented could make real change.
Yeah. So just in comparing the UK and the US, and I've encountered it a lot being here, that they've said, just in being here, we're not fearful of our lives. And so therefore we should be grateful that the UK is not as racist, that, maybe it's more under wraps, that the racism is just maybe a little bit more exclusionary, but it's never something where, we should feel in danger that we might die as we would encounter in the US. So how do we really get people to understand that there still are those serious issues that we are facing, even in the police force here, and just holistically in the environment of being in the UK? How do we get them to take the racism issues that we have here as seriously, or even more serious, without comparing it over across the pond, as you had alluded to before?
Well, there are specific issues here, and the specific issues, I think, principally here in Europe, is that we are a serious minority. The Black community here in the UK makes up 4% of the population. And the truth is, if you're 4% of the population, the majority sometimes can't see, can't hear, don't know, don't care. So we can't get there without serious allyship. It's why here in Parliament, I've always allied myself with the causes of women, the causes of other minority groups, particularly sexual minority groups as well, because that business of solidarity is really important. You've got to have allies in the fight. It's got to go beyond your minority group if things are going to really change. There's a lot of discussion about blackness, but I think intellectually it's important to understand that there's very little that we're saying in this conversation that's new. A new conversation would be about whiteness. Why is this still persisting? In whose interest is it that it still persists? So allyship, I think, is very important, and to understand the differences between the United States and the UK. My experience of studying in the United States, working and living in the United States, is that the United States does understand its history. It fought a civil war over it, almost broke up the Union in a very, very real way. The period of slavery is real in the United States history. So they understand their past, and their future is incredibly contested, as we've seen with the ping pong between Barack Obama on the one side and then bounding to Donald Trump on the other. I think here in Europe, what you'll find is that the past, there's a sort of amnesia and an ignorance. You'll find very few people who know, for example, who Sam Sharp is. But any Jamaican will tell you who he is, because he led some fantastic rebellions against the slave trade in Jamaica. Or Coffee in Guyana. They don't know who he is, but they will tell you who William Wilberforce is. So there's a sort of misunderstanding, often an ignorance about the past. You'll get a lot of, look, we ended the slave trade. And very little understanding of how little those former enslaved people got when they were emancipated. I mean, what does it mean when you're stripped of your language, stripped of your religion, stripped of your culture? Sometimes your children are separated from you. Your wife is separated from you, raped in front of you. What does it mean to experience that trauma over hundreds of years and then to be set free with nothing? And how long does it take you to build something from that nothing and from that void and from that trauma? I suspect it takes a few hundred years, and that's where we are. And so that history is not sufficiently understood, and people are ambivalent about it. In fact, sometimes it's deliberately misunderstood. But the present, I think, in Europe is better understood than it is sometimes in the United States. On the whole, sadly, with this nonsense commission and the government's attitude to systemic racism, we've taken a backward step. But I think that we will overcome eventually.
Yeah, those are powerful words. We will overcome, I think, is something that we can take away from this and hold to our hearts as we go forward and try to find a new path and a new way to start new conversations and enter a new wave. So thank you so much, really, David, for joining us, for answering our questions. We really, really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and I'm looking forward to being able to rest up, and you guys can take up the baton in the years ahead.
Yeah, we're looking forward to getting out there, definitely. Thank you so much, David. Thank you also on behalf of the Oxford Black Alumni Network, which we just recently have started, but we're really excited to have more conversations like this and actually get the ball rolling in whatever ways we can from this side. Yeah,
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
All right, have a good day, David.